Where are my kids? My voice ripped through the evening air, raw and desperate, as I stumbled across the empty playground. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might tear through my chest. Just minutes ago, my children had been here, their laughter ringing in the air like music, their small sneakers scuffing against the sand as they raced each other to the swings. Their jackets still hung loosely over the park bench where I had been sitting, scrolling through my phone and watching them out of the corner of my eye. But now, nothing. Silence. A playground that should have been filled with joy was suddenly as hollow as an abandoned house. At first, I thought maybe they had run toward the slides or hidden behind the bushes to play a prank on me. My kids loved to play hide and seek, and sometimes they giggled so hard they gave themselves away. But this time there was no giggling, no sound at all. My voice echoed as I called their names, louder each time, panic rising with every unanswered second. I could feel my hands starting to shake as I dialed their friends' parents, anyone who might have seen them. No one had, and then just as the fear threatened to consume me, my phone buzzed. A message. My eyes scanned the screen and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't from a stranger, wasn't from some anonymous number. It was from the president of our homeowners association. If you want your children back, we need to talk about your constant violations. For a moment, my brain couldn't even process what I was reading. Violations? HOA violations? Surely this had to be a sick prank. But the longer I stared at the message, the more the truth sank in, cold and heavy. My kids hadn't just wandered off. They had been taken. And not by criminals in masks, not by some faceless predator, but by people I saw at community meetings. People who lived down the street. People who smiled and waved when they passed me on the sidewalk. My stomach twisted as I rushed to the community security cameras. I knew where they were positioned. I had complained about them often enough when the HOA used them to nitpick every little detail of our lives. And there it was, right on the screen. My children being led into a van. Not screaming, not fighting. Confused, uncertain. Holding the hands of two board members as if they were being escorted somewhere safe. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. I recognized those faces. Neighbors. People who had fined me for having the wrong color curtains in my front window. People who had once knocked on my door because my trash cans were out an hour too early. My blood turned to ice, but then it boiled with rage. They had crossed a line no one should ever cross. This wasn't about lawn care or mailbox paint anymore. This was my family. This was my children. The playground around me suddenly felt hostile. The neatly trimmed hedges and perfect sidewalks like bars of a cage. The HOA had always felt suffocating with their endless rules, their petty fines, their constant need to control every inch of the neighborhood. But this was something darker. A warning. A show of power. A way to remind me and maybe everyone else who really controlled this community. My hands shook as I read the message again. My throat was dry, but my anger gave me clarity. They wanted me scared. They wanted me desperate. They wanted me to beg for my children back. But what they didn't know was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. I gripped my phone tighter, 1,000 thoughts racing at once. I needed to get them back. I needed to stay calm, think clearly, and not let panic consume me. But most of all, I needed to remember exactly who I was and what I was capable of. The HOA thought they were dealing with just another homeowner, another parent too beaten down by fines and threats to fight back. They thought they could use fear to bend me into submission. But they didn't realize they had taken the children of someone who lived by the law, enforced the law, and held more power than they could possibly imagine. The streetlights flickered on as night fell, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. Every window seemed to be watching me, every car parked at the curb a potential threat. My neighborhood, once a place where I thought my kids were safe, now felt like enemy territory. And with each step I took back toward my house, one thing became clearer and clearer. The HOA had declared war on me, and they had no idea who they were up against. For months, the HOA had been my personal nightmare, a group of people who seemed to wake up every morning looking for new ways to make my life miserable. It started small. Notes about my lawn being an inch too high, letters about the color of my shutters not matching the community palette, Warnings about the kids' bicycles being left on the driveway. At first I laughed it off. I figured it was just overzealous neighbors with too much free time. But the longer I lived there, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about rules. It was about control. They fined me for the tiniest infractions. A few leaves left on the sidewalk in the fall? $50. A garden gnome my kids had bought me for Father's Day. A violation notice demanding its removal because it didn't fit the community image. It was absurd, petty, and exhausting. Most people around here just paid the fines quietly, too afraid of retaliation to speak up. I refused. I didn't see why I should bow down to their bullying, but I had no idea how far they would go. That night, while I was still reeling from the message about my children, another notification buzzed on my phone. My stomach sank as I read it. Your refusal to respect our community standards will no longer be tolerated. You will comply, or else. The words were like a punch to the chest. They weren't even pretending anymore. This wasn't about enforcing rules. This was blackmail, pure and simple. I tried calling the HOA president, hoping, maybe praying, that this was some twisted attempt at intimidation, that my kids were safe and this was all some kind of bluff. But she didn't pick up. Instead, one of the board members answered. His voice was calm, casual even, like we were discussing the weather. We just want you to take us seriously, he said, as if kidnapping my children was some minor inconvenience. No one ignores this HOA. Bring yourself to tomorrow's meeting and we'll consider releasing your children. The arrogance in his tone made my blood boil. They spoke as if they were untouchable, as if the HOA gave them the right to decide who could breathe in this neighborhood and who couldn't. It wasn't enough for them to control what flowers we planted or when we put out our trash cans. They wanted absolute obedience, and anyone who pushed back, anyone like me, would be made an example of. I hung up, my hands trembling, fury and fear fighting for dominance inside me. How dare they? How dare they use my children as pawns in their power game? What kind of people smiled at block parties, hosted community picnics, and then turned around and used innocent kids as leverage? I knew they were petty, but this was something darker, something far more dangerous. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every flicker of light from the neighboring houses felt suspicious, every shadow behind a curtain, like an eye tracking me. I realized that maybe this wasn't just about me. Maybe they wanted to send a message to everyone else in the community. Maybe my kids were collateral, proof that resistance came with a cost. The thought made me sick, but they had miscalculated. They thought they were dealing with just another resident, someone too scared to fight back, someone who would come crawling on their knees to the next HOA meeting. They thought they could bend me with fear, break me with threats. They had no idea that by crossing this line, they had set something in motion they couldn't control. As I sat in the silence of my living room, staring at the smug words glowing on my phone screen, my fear hardened into resolve. The HOA had spent months treating me like I was powerless. They thought they were the law in this neighborhood. What they didn't realize was that their game had just escalated into something they couldn't win. They thought they were holding all the cards, but the truth was, they had just exposed themselves. And when the time came, I would make sure they regretted every single step they had taken. What the HOA didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly know, was that I wasn't just another ordinary resident living on their perfectly manicured streets. To them, I was just a neighbor with kids who occasionally forgot to bring the trash bins in on time. Someone who rolled his eyes at their ridiculous violation letters and refused to cower when they sent fines. They saw me as stubborn, maybe even reckless, but harmless. And that assumption was the greatest mistake they had ever made. Because by day, behind the quiet life of mowing lawns and walking my kids to school, I wore a different face. I was a federal judge. My name carried weight in courtrooms where lives were decided, where criminals who thought they were untouchable found out just how wrong they were. Every day I enforced the law with precision and authority. I had sentenced drug lords, corrupt politicians, and organized crime leaders. I had heard every excuse, every arrogant plea for mercy, and through it all I had learned to keep my own life private. In my neighborhood, I never advertised who I was. I didn't hang degrees on my walls where nosy HOA inspectors could peek through windows. I didn't talk about cases at community barbecues. My children didn't even fully understand the scope of my job. It was easier that way. Safer. But now, as I sat with my phone in my hand, the faces of my children burned into my mind. I realized that my silence had given the HOA a false sense of power. They thought I was just another parent they could bully into submission. They thought they were the ultimate authority here. And they were about to find out how wrong they were. The first thing I did was gather evidence. Every text, every call, every grainy second of camera footage showing my children being led away. I documented it all, carefully, methodically, as if I were preparing for a trial, because in a way, I was. But this wasn't going to be a trial they could drag out with lawyers and neighborhood politics. This was criminal, this was federal, and this was personal. I reached out to a trusted colleague in law enforcement, someone who had worked cases with me for years. When I explained what had happened, there was silence on the other end of the line, as if even a seasoned investigator couldn't believe what they were hearing. Finally, he said, "You're telling me your HOA kidnapped your children over neighborhood violations?" The disbelief in his voice almost made me laugh, but the sound caught in my throat. "Yes," I said simply. "And I have proof." Within the hour, a federal investigation was in motion. Agents reviewed the evidence, shaking their heads, muttering under their breath about the sheer audacity of it all. This wasn't just a civil dispute. This wasn't about fines or ordinances. This was kidnapping, extortion, conspiracy, felonies. They couldn't believe it, but they also couldn't deny it. Still, I wasn't content to sit back and let the system work on its own timeline. Every hour that passed was an hour my children were in someone else's hands. I knew they were being used as leverage, not harmed yet, but that knowledge didn't calm me. If anything, it made the situation more dangerous. Desperate people made desperate decisions, and the HOA board had already shown they were willing to cross lines. No one else would dare. I spent that night planning, running through every possible angle. I knew they would expect me at the meeting they had demanded. They thought they held all the power, but I was coming in with something far stronger than fear. I was coming in with the law, with backup, with the weight of authority they couldn't even begin to challenge. As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I thought of my children's faces, confused, maybe scared, wondering why familiar neighbors had suddenly turned into captors. I thought of the smug look the HOA president always wore when she slid violation letters into people's mailboxes, the way she strutted around the community like a queen on her throne. I thought of the board members who whispered to each other at meetings, gleeful at every new rule they created, convinced of their absolute power. They had no idea that the tables were about to turn. They had no idea that the man they thought they were bullying was the same man who had the authority to destroy everything they had built. They wanted me to bow down to them, but instead, they had just dragged themselves into a fight they couldn't win. By morning, the plan was clear. I would walk into that meeting, but not as the powerless resident they thought I was. I would walk in as the one thing they had never anticipated, a federal judge ready to deliver justice. The following evening, I walked into the HOA meeting hall with a calmness that surprised even me. On the outside, I looked composed, my steps steady, my expression unreadable. On the inside, my chest burned with anger and a quiet determination. This was the moment everything had been building toward. My children were in that building, and the people who had dared to take them were sitting smugly behind a long wooden table, pretending they were untouchable. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting a harsh glow on the faces of the board members. They were dressed in their usual attire, business casual, their blazers and collared shirts giving them an air of authority they hadn't earned. The president of the HOA, a woman who had made it her mission to terrorize the neighborhood with violation letters and fines, leaned forward with a smile that dripped with satisfaction. She thought she had already won. "We're glad you finally decided to cooperate," she said, her voice smooth but smug. "Now let's discuss your violations." The others chuckled quietly, like a pack of vultures circling a wounded animal. Their arrogance was suffocating, the kind of false confidence that comes from people who've never been challenged. I didn't answer. Instead, I set a thick folder down on the table in front of them. The sound echoed through the hall, drawing curious glances from the few residents seated in the back rows. The board members exchanged nervous looks. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the folder and slid copies of federal charges across the table. Kidnapping, extortion, conspiracy. Their smiles faltered. "What is this supposed to be?" one of them scoffed, though I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his tone. I didn't waste words. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my badge. The polished metal caught the light, gleaming under the fluorescent bulbs. The room fell into silence. "I am Judge Last Name Federal Court," I said evenly, my voice carrying across the room. "You didn't just cross a line, you obliterated it. And as of this moment, you're all under investigation." The president's face drained of color. Her smug smile evaporated, replaced by a look of horror she couldn't mask. You're a judge?" She stammered, her confidence unraveling in an instant. "Yes," I replied, "and I have every piece of evidence I need to put you behind bars for a very long time." Before they could respond, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. Federal agents, armed and ready, swept into the room with practiced precision. Residents gasped, standing to their feet as the reality of the situation hit them. The board members who had once strutted around the neighborhood like dictators were suddenly frozen in their chairs. Their authority stripped away in seconds. The agents moved swiftly, placing each of them in handcuffs. Some protested, sputtering excuses, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. Others broke down, begging for mercy, their arrogance dissolving into pitiful desperation. The same people who had threatened me with fines for garden decorations now pleaded for their freedom, as the law they had mocked closed in around them. But my eyes weren't on them. They were on the back room, the small door behind the table where I knew my children were being kept. An agent moved quickly, pushing it open, and a moment later my kids ran out. Their little feet pounded across the floor as they spotted me, their eyes wide with fear that melted into relief. I dropped to my knees, pulling them into my arms, holding them so tightly I could feel their hearts racing against mine. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice breaking as I kissed the tops of their heads. "It's over. You're safe now." The noise of the arrests faded into the background as I focused on the only thing that mattered, my children, trembling but alive, clinging to me like they never wanted to let go. I rocked them gently, my own tears burning my eyes, but I didn't let go. Not yet. When I finally stood, my children's hands gripping mine, I looked at the HOA board members one last time. The president, now in handcuffs, glared at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief. She had thought she controlled this neighborhood. She had thought she could control me. But now she was just another criminal being escorted out of the hall, her reign of petty terror shattered forever. As the agents led them away, the residents who had gathered in the back began to whisper. Some were shocked, others relieved, and a few even smiled faintly, as if they had been waiting years for someone to finally stand up to the HOA. I knew then that this wasn't just about me and my family. This was about the entire community, finally freed from the grip of people who had abused their power for far too long. I squeezed my children's hands, guiding them out of the hall and into the cool night air. The stars above seemed brighter than they had in weeks, and as I looked at my kids' tired but safe faces, I promised myself one thing: never again would anyone hold power over us through fear. That night, justice hadn't just been served in a courtroom. It had been delivered right there, in the heart of a neighborhood that had forgotten what freedom felt like. My children clung to me the entire night after the arrests, their small arms wrapped tightly around my waist, as if letting go would mean losing me again. I tucked them into bed, sat by their side until their breathing finally steadied, and only then allowed myself to exhale. But even in the quiet of my home, with the flashing red and blue lights gone from the street, the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on my shoulders. The idea that people we saw every day, neighbors who waved from their porches, who smiled during community events, had taken my children, had held them hostage for power, was almost too much to process. By morning, the story had already hit the news. Reporters crowded outside the neighborhood gates, their cameras catching every second, as federal agents escorted the handcuffed board members to waiting vehicles. Headlines blared across the country: HOA members arrested for kidnapping federal judge's children. The story sounded so absurd that people thought it had to be satire, but it wasn't. It was very real, and my children were living proof of just how dangerous unchecked power could become. Neighbors who had once remained silent started speaking out. One by one, families came forward with stories of harassment, intimidation, and threats. A single mother described how she had been fined hundreds of dollars for letting her son's basketball hoop sit in the driveway. An elderly couple admitted they had been threatened with foreclosure over a flower bed that wasn't HOA approved. People had stayed quiet out of fear, afraid of retaliation, afraid of losing their homes. But after what happened to my children, that fear turned into outrage. I attended an emergency community meeting days later, this time not as a parent being scolded, but as someone everyone turned to for answers. The room buzzed with anger, grief, and relief all at once. Some people cried as they shared their stories. Others clenched their fists, furious that they had allowed the board's bullying to go on for so long. When it came time to vote, the decision was nearly unanimous. The HOA would be dissolved. The very organization that had once ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist was gone, in a single night. But for me, the true victory wasn't in the dismantling of the HOA. It was in the safety of my children. I couldn't stop replaying the moment they ran into my arms at the meeting hall, their eyes wide with fear and relief. That memory fueled me every time I felt anger rising, every time the weight of the case threatened to overwhelm me. Justice was moving forward, charges were being filed, and the people responsible for tearing apart my family would spend decades behind bars. But no sentence could erase the fear my children had felt, or the betrayal of being taken by people they thought they could trust. As weeks passed, the neighborhood began to heal. Without the HOA breathing down everyone's necks, life felt lighter, freer. Children played in the streets again without parents worrying about fines. Homes were decorated with flowers, flags, and colors that expressed individuality instead of conformity. For the first time in years, people felt like the community truly belonged to them. I often found myself walking past the playground where it had all started. The swings creaked softly in the breeze, and the sound, once haunting, began to feel like a promise. My children laughed again when they played there, though I never let them out of my sight. Healing takes time, and while they were smiling again, I knew the scars of fear would take longer to fade. Still, every laugh, every squeal of joy reminded me that they were resilient. We all were. Sometimes neighbors would stop me during those walks, their expressions filled with gratitude. They thanked me for standing up, for not giving in, for exposing the truth. But I always told them the same thing. It wasn't about me. It was about justice. It was about protecting the innocent and reminding those who abused their power that no one, not even a board of homeowners with inflated egos, was above the law. Late one night, as I sat on my porch watching the stars, I thought about the irony of it all. The HOA had tried to break me, to force me into compliance by using the most precious thing in my life as leverage. They had assumed I was weak, powerless, just another name on their list of residents to control. Instead, their actions had exposed them for what they truly were, criminals hiding behind rules and regulations. They had wanted me on my knees, but they ended up in handcuffs. Justice had been served, not in a courtroom filled with formality, but right there in the heart of the community they had poisoned with fear. My children were safe, the neighborhood was free, and the people who thought they were untouchable had discovered that there is always someone willing to stand up to bullies, no matter what form they take. To anyone listening to this story, I hope you take one lesson with you. Never underestimate the power of justice. Never let fear silence you. And never forget that even in the darkest moments, when it feels like all hope is lost, the truth will always find its way to the surface. Because sometimes, the people you think you're pushing around are carrying more power than you could ever imagine.